Some suffering does more than hurt. It can make life itself look questionable for a moment. Not because you are being dramatic, because something happened and the old explanations suddenly sound thin. The pain is real, the loss is real. But what unsettles you most may be the thought that a life which allows this has been caught failing its own test. That is the pressure Nietzsche walks into. Not pain makes you stronger, not use suffering well, not turn the wound into a lesson. He wants to know what standard is already speaking when suffering starts to look like evidence against life. By the end of tonight, we will not have made suffering useful or comforting. We will have stayed with the moment when pain starts to sound like a verdict until a harder question becomes visible. When suffering seems to condemn life, what is doing the condemning? If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with us, subscribing helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. You know the kind of moment this question begins from. Something has already happened. The phone call has ended. The diagnosis has been named. The betrayal has stopped being a suspicion. Or maybe nothing so dramatic has occurred. Maybe it is only the slow hour after fear, grief, or humiliation has settled in, when the world keeps moving as if nothing basic has changed. That is often when suffering stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a statement about life itself. At first, the thought is simple enough. This should not happen. No one should be asked to carry this. That reaction deserves respect. There is real moral truth in it. We resist cruelty for a reason. We grieve because something precious has been damaged. We protect the vulnerable because pain is not neutral. Nietzsche does not begin by denying any of that. But there is another movement inside the same moment, and it is quieter. The thought no longer stays with what happened. It spreads. If life can contain this, what kind of life is it? If the structure of things leaves room for this much exposure, can life still be trusted at all? That is the shift everything turns on. Suffering is no longer only pain within life. It has started to look like evidence against life. We should slow down there, not to correct the sufferer, not to turn grief into an intellectual exercise, only to notice that a step has been taken. The hurt has become a claim. The event has become an accusation. The hurt is now being asked to say something about existence as a whole. That step can feel so natural that we miss it completely. Someone loses what they love, and the mind does not stay with the loss alone. It begins to judge the world that allowed the loss. Someone is struck by illness, and the question is not only how to endure it or fight it. The question becomes whether a life built out of vulnerable bodies was always hiding a defect. We know this movement because many of us have felt it. Pain can make the whole arrangement of life look suspect, and yet suspicion is not the same as proof. That difference matters. If suffering becomes a verdict against life too quickly, then suffering is doing more than hurting. It is also carrying a standard, even if no one has said what the standard is. Life is being measured against an image of what life should have been. The image may feel obvious. No loss like this. No fragility this deep. No event that leaves the soul asking whether the whole thing was badly made. But Nietzsche wants to know where that image came from and what kind of life it imagines. This is why the argument cannot begin with doctrine. Before Schopenhauer, before tragedy, before recurrence, there is a human pressure point the philosopher has to meet honestly. A person in pain does not first ask whether their judgment is metaphysically coherent. They ask how life can include this at all. If philosophy arrives too fast, it becomes a form of bad manners. The question must be allowed to breathe in ordinary language first. Imagine that every explanation has been taken away for a moment. No lesson, no hidden reward, no claim that this will all make sense later. Just the fact itself and the life that contains it. For many people, that is when pain becomes hardest to bear. Not because it grows physically stronger, but because it starts to feel unsupported by meaning. The mind reaches for a larger sentence. If this can happen, what does it say about the world I live in? That reach toward a larger sentence is the beginning of the larger judgment Nietzsche suspects. We do not need the legal metaphor too hard, because the feeling is familiar without it. Life has come under suspicion. The event feels like testimony. The sufferer becomes, without choosing it, the person through whom a judgment about existence is being made. Now, that judgment may still seem entirely reasonable. Why should it not? If life includes deep suffering, why should life not answer for it? The answer cannot be that suffering is secretly fine, or that questioning life is immature. Nietzsche would become unbearable if that were his move. His real question is sharper. Does suffering itself prove that life has failed, or does it expose a prior expectation that life should have been free of fragility, chance, dependence, and loss? We need to keep two truths together. First, harm is real, and resistance to harm is necessary. If a person says this never should have happened, they may be naming an actual wrong that calls for justice, care, or protection. Second, the step from this was wrong to life itself stands condemned is not automatic. It may feel automatic, it may even be emotionally irresistible, but it is still a step, and Nietzsche wants it brought into the light. That distinction keeps the thought from becoming callous. A child dies, a body breaks, trust is shattered. Some forms of suffering are so extreme that the demand for explanation can feel like the only remaining sign of dignity. No serious reading of Nietzsche should mock that. The issue is not whether the cry is understandable. The issue is whether the cry has quietly taken on metaphysical authority, whether it now speaks as if pain itself knows the value of existence. We can see the same structure in smaller, ordinary experiences too. A desire fails, a relationship ends, a humiliation stays in the body longer than it should. You may not say life is worthless, but you may feel, for a minute or an hour, that life has been exposed as something less trustworthy than you hoped. That is enough. The accusation does not need grand language to be real. The social world often deepens it. People around us offer comfort, and their comfort often carries philosophy inside it. This should not have happened. The universe can be cruel. Life is unfair. God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. Each sentence may soothe one part of the soul while guiding another part toward a broader judgment. Even tenderness can smuggle in a view of life, so the argument is not asking whether suffering hurts. Of course it does. It is not asking whether some suffering should be fought. Of course it should. It is asking why suffering so often spreads beyond the event and begins to function as an argument. Why does pain so quickly become a lens through which life itself is judged? That question has to be answered before Nietzsche can say anything worth hearing. If we skip it, we turn him into a stylist of toughness, someone who simply tells us to endure more bravely. But Nietzsche is interested in something harder than endurance. He wants to know why we expect life to justify itself on terms that may already exclude life as it is actually lived. At this point, we are still in the same quiet aftermath where we started. Nothing has been redeemed, nothing has been explained away. What has changed is only this. The accusation has become visible as an accusation. Pain has started to speak beyond itself, and the next step is to hear the thinker who gives that accusation its strongest philosophical form. That thinker is Schopenhauer. There is another reason the first step matters so much. If we do not separate the event from the larger verdict, Nietzsche will always sound cruel. He will sound like someone interrupting grief to make a clever point. But the real point is slower and more exact. Suffering may be the occasion of the judgment, without being its full argument. That means the judgment deserves to be examined, even when the pain itself deserves only care. You can see the difference in how language shifts around us after something hard happens. At first, people ask what occurred. Then, very quickly, the larger sentences arrive. Life is unfair. The universe is cruel. Reality cannot be trusted. The mind searches for a hole big enough to contain the wound, and in doing so it often begins speaking as if the hole itself has been exposed. That widening movement is so common that it can feel like part of pain itself, and yet widening is not the same as truth. It may reveal a genuine insight about fragility. It may also reveal the image of life we were carrying before the event arrived. Perhaps we believed, without saying it, that a livable world would shelter us from this depth of breakage. Perhaps we believed that suffering on this scale could only belong to a badly ordered reality. Nietzsche wants that belief brought into the open before it is allowed to rule. This is why the argument has to stay close to ordinary speech. Once the issue becomes too theoretical too quickly, the living force of the problem disappears. A philosophy of suffering that forgets the human moment where suffering becomes a verdict has already started lying about what it is trying to understand. Most of us know this rhythm before we ever learn Schopenhauer's name. You want something badly. You imagine rest on the other side of getting it. Then you get it, and the relief does not last. Another need opens, or boredom arrives, or the thing itself becomes ordinary the moment it is yours. Schopenhauer matters because he treats that familiar rhythm as evidence about the structure of life. He does not say suffering is important only when catastrophe strikes. He says suffering is built much deeper than that. To live as a willing creature is already to live under pressure. We desire what we do not have. We strain toward it. If we fail, we feel frustration. If we succeed, the satisfaction fades. Then the space that opens can feel empty enough to send us searching again. Life, on this view, is not mainly interrupted by suffering. It is organized by unrest. That is why Schopenhauer's pessimism is stronger than a list of complaints. He is not simply counting bad days against good ones. He is asking what kind of being we are if our deepest movement is always wanting, lacking, striving, and never finally arriving. The problem is structural rather than occasional. Suffering is not a flaw in an otherwise finished design. It belongs to the form of willing itself. You can feel why that thought bites. Even ordinary desire carries it. Think of the thing you once believed would settle you: a relationship, a job, recognition, a degree of safety. Sometimes the thing arrives, and what follows is not rest but a thinner, stranger feeling. The horizon moves, another hunger forms, or the life you worked for becomes normal faster than you thought it would. Schopenhauer's point is not that pleasure is unreal, it is that pleasure rarely closes the circuit for long. And when satisfaction does not close the circuit, boredom becomes philosophically important. Boredom is not just spare time gone stale. It reveals what happens when the will has no fresh object to chase. The restlessness does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes heaviness, irritation, agitation, emptiness. Schopenhauer treats that experience as proof that the will is not fulfilled by its objects. It only moves from lack to relief to lack again. This gives the objection to life a stronger foundation than grief alone could provide. Earlier we began with the moment when pain seems to accuse life. Schopenhauer now says the accusation does not depend on unusual tragedy. It can be read in the daily rhythm of human wanting. If desire is never finally satisfied, and if peace arrives only in brief interruptions, then life may look less like a good arrangement damaged by isolated pain, and more like an arrangement whose engine is dissatisfaction. That is the force Nietzsche has to face. If he answered Schopenhauer with a brighter mood, it would mean nothing. If he answered by saying there are still beautiful moments, Schopenhauer could agree and still keep his case. Pleasant moments do not refute the structure. The structure remains one of pressure, temporary relief, renewed pressure. A person can love life and still notice that pattern. A philosopher can notice it and conclude that life stands self-condemned. Schopenhauer's path from diagnosis to verdict matters here. He does not stop at saying the world is hard. He moves toward denying or quieting the will. If willing is the source of suffering, then release seems to require distance from willing itself. Art becomes valuable because it can suspend desire. Compassion becomes valuable because it recognizes a shared condition of pain. Asceticism becomes attractive because it weakens the drives that keep the wheel turning. Notice how serious that is. Schopenhauer is not proposing cheap optimism or personal branding through suffering. He is saying the deepest wisdom may lie in loosening our attachment to the very machinery that makes life feel alive. The implication is severe. If willing is the problem, then the will to live begins to look like the thing that must be softened, redirected, or denied. That is also why his view can feel morally dignified rather than merely gloomy. Schopenhauer does not use suffering to judge the weak. He uses suffering to ground compassion. If every creature is caught in striving and frustration, then cruelty becomes harder to justify. The person in pain is not an exception. They are a window into the shared condition of being alive. Nietzsche inherits this seriousness about suffering even where he parts from Schopenhauer's conclusion. Still, the conclusion matters. Once the highest peace is imagined as release from willing, life is being measured against an ideal that looks suspiciously unlike life. Movement, desire, risk, and embodiment all begin to look like liabilities. The world of striving is tolerated at best. At worst, it is condemned. Schopenhauer has taken the private accusation we began with and given it a philosophical body. Life hurts not by accident but by structure. Therefore, life itself may be the problem. We should let that land, not because Nietzsche will stay there, but because his later yes means nothing if this no is not first allowed to cut all the way in. The polished versions of Nietzsche on the internet skip this step. They move straight from hardship to strength, as if suffering were material for character building. Schopenhauer prevents that shortcut. He asks whether suffering reveals a defect in existence, not an opportunity for self-improvement. There is another reason his view retains power. It does not depend on rare disasters. It depends on repetition. The same wanting, the same fading after arrival, the same dissatisfaction that returns even in comfort. A life can look enviable from outside and still confirm Schopenhauer's point from within. That universality makes pessimism harder to dismiss as mood or trauma. And there is a deep temptation in his solution. Anyone exhausted by desire can understand why rest begins to look holier than striving. Anyone worn down by disappointment can understand the appeal of wanting less, needing less, stepping back from the contest entirely. Schopenhauer gives philosophical shape to that temptation. He makes retreat from willing look not cowardly but lucid. Nietzsche respects him for that lucidity. He sees in Schopenhauer an honesty that many more cheerful philosophies lack. But he also hears something else in the proposed escape. He hears a standard of value that quietly assumes the best state would be one with less desire, less exposure, less becoming. In other words, a state less entangled with what living actually is. That is where the argument gets hardest. The issue is no longer whether suffering exists. Of course it does. The issue is whether suffering proves that the very conditions of life are unacceptable. Schopenhauer says yes in one of the strongest ways philosophy has ever said it. If willing builds dissatisfaction into our structure, then the peace we want may only appear where life loosens its own grip. Before moving on, it helps to state the contrast clearly. A lighter objection would say, life has too many painful moments. Schopenhauer's objection says, pain belongs to the grammar of existence because willing never fully comes home. That is why his pessimism remains the necessary pressure point for Nietzsche. It is not an emotional mood to outgrow. It is a philosophical challenge that demands a different account of what it means to affirm life without lying about its unrest. From here, the story could turn toward resignation. Instead, Nietzsche turns toward tragedy, not because tragedy explains suffering away, because tragedy asks whether there is a form of seeing in which terror stays visible, and yet life is not immediately condemned for containing it. And the moral seriousness of Schopenhauer should not be missed. Because willing exposes creatures to lack and frustration, compassion becomes more than a pleasant virtue. It becomes a recognition that others are trapped in the same structure. That is one reason Schopenhauer can feel humane even at his bleakest. He does not derive suffering from weakness or failure. He treats it as something woven into being alive. This matters for Nietzsche because it blocks one of the cheapest reactions. If pessimism were only resentment, laziness, or a bad mood, then answering it would be easy. But Schopenhauer's view is harder to escape because it can begin from lucidity and sympathy rather than bitterness. Nietzsche has to answer a thinker who sees pain clearly and still concludes that life is fundamentally at fault. The everyday force of this can be felt in small repetitions. You finish the task you thought would settle you. The rest lasts 10 minutes. Then another demand opens. You imagine that peace will come once the conditions are right. The conditions improve, and the mind still invents a lack. Schopenhauer sees this and says the problem is not that we have chosen the wrong objects. The problem is the engine of willing itself. That is why his pessimism keeps returning in modern life, even among people who have never read him. Whenever someone says that getting what they wanted did not touch the deeper unrest, they are standing very close to Schopenhauer's world. Nietzsche knows that world too well to answer it with optimism. There is another thing tragedy does that matters for Nietzsche. It stops us from imagining that clarity always has to come with explanation. In ordinary life, when something breaks us, people rush in with reasons. This happened for a purpose. This will teach you something. One day you will understand why. Tragedy does something stranger. It can leave the wound standing there without that extra layer and still keep the world from collapsing into nonsense. That is already a serious achievement. Many people do not need pain made beautiful. They need a form strong enough to hold pain without lying about it. A tragic scene can do that. It can say, "This is terrible, this remains terrible," and yet the terrible does not automatically become an argument that existence itself should be revoked. You can feel why that matters if you think about the moments when language fails after loss. The first sentences often sound borrowed. They belong to greeting cards, rituals, old sayings, or half-believed comforts. But every now and then a poem, a piece of music, or even a few lines from a play manage something rarer. They do not explain what happened. They do not repair it. They simply give the grief a shape in which it can breathe without having to defend itself. Nietzsche sees that as more than aesthetic pleasure. He sees it as evidence that human beings are not condemned to two choices only: either cover suffering with consoling meaning, or condemn life for containing suffering at all. Tragedy opens a third posture, though not an easy one. It is the posture of staying present. And staying present is difficult because the mind does not like to remain there for long. It wants verdict or rescue. It wants the pain to tell us what the world is, or it wants a world beyond the pain. Tragic form slows both movements down. It makes room for witness. That witness matters because a witnessed pain is different from a pain immediately turned into doctrine. Once suffering has been seen, shared, sounded, and held in a form, it is no longer only private pressure exploding toward judgment. It becomes something a human being can bear to look at for one moment longer. That extra moment is small, but it changes a lot. Without it, condemnation can feel like the only honest response. With it, another possibility appears. Not redemption, not optimism, but a steadier gaze. This is also why Nietzsche's attraction to tragedy is not sentimental. He is not saying art saves us by making us feel deep. He is saying art may train a capacity we desperately need, the capacity to remain near what hurts without instantly needing either revenge against life or refuge from it. And if that capacity is real, then Schopenhauer's verdict is no longer the only serious response available. It is still serious, it still wounds, but it is no longer alone. What if suffering is not first answered by explanation, but by a way of seeing? That is the turn tragedy makes possible for Nietzsche. After Schopenhauer, the temptation is obvious. If willing binds us to frustration, if loss and unrest are built into existence, then perhaps the honest conclusion is simple. Life has failed its own test. Tragedy interrupts that conclusion without trying to make the terrible look harmless. When Nietzsche writes about Greek tragedy in The Birth of Tragedy, he is not offering an elegant cover story for pain. He is trying to understand how a culture could look directly at terror, destruction, and fragility, without immediately turning those things into a final indictment of existence. That is why tragedy matters here. It does not remove the blow. It does not tell us that the blow was deserved. It does not produce a moral lesson in which pain quietly earns its place. It keeps the terrible in view. That sounds simpler than it is. Most of us want more than sight. We want explanation, rescue, balance, or at least the promise that pain serves some intelligible order. Tragedy withholds that kind of comfort. It leaves suffering present, and yet the final movement is not necessarily repudiation. Nietzsche sees that as a clue. His early language of the Apollonian and the Dionysian tries to name two things human beings need when facing suffering. The Apollonian gives form, image, contour, and enough distance for something to be seen. The Dionysian breaks ordinary boundaries, exposes terror and excess, and reminds us that the ordered self is less stable than it likes to believe. Tragedy joins both. Without form, terror overwhelms. Without terror, form becomes decoration. Together they create a way of facing what would otherwise drive us straight toward denial. You can feel the human force of that without knowing anything about Greek theatre. There are moments when suffering becomes worse because it has no shape at all. The mind cannot hold it still. Every sentence seems false or thin. Tragic form does not solve that condition, but it can keep the pain from dissolving into pure formlessness. It lets the thing be witnessed without being turned at once into either consolation or accusation. This is one reason Nietzsche parts from Schopenhauer even while learning from him. For Schopenhauer, art offers temporary release from the will, a brief suspension of restless striving. Nietzsche wants something harsher. Art matters not only because it lets us escape the pressure for a moment, but because it may train us to remain with life as it is, even where life includes terror, fracture, and loss. That should not be mistaken for heroics. The tragic response is not chest-forward toughness. It is not the pose of someone too proud to need comfort. It is closer to steadiness. Look at what is there. Do not make it prettier than it is. Do not demand that it become innocent before you can bear to see it. That is already a major difference from the ordinary movement of consolation. This is also why tragedy cannot be reduced to saying that suffering becomes beautiful. Beauty can lie. Beauty can be used to soften what should stay sharp. Nietzsche's tragic instinct is harder than that. Form matters because it keeps the terrible visible long enough for us to remain in relation to it. The value is not prettification. The value is endurance of sight. The chorus helps here, even if we mention it only briefly. The chorus does not master catastrophe. It does not undo it. It witnesses, responds, grieves, and endures. That matters because it suggests a human possibility between denial and collapse. One may not be able to justify suffering, and still may not need to condemn existence immediately for containing it. We should notice how demanding this is. A person can stand before tragedy and still ask what all of it means. They can still want an answer, a reason, a metaphysical settlement. Tragedy does not satisfy that demand. It only shows that there may be a form of vision in which terror remains visible without automatically becoming a proof that life itself should be refused. There is something in ordinary experience that recognizes this even without the formal language. Most of us have encountered a piece of music, or a novel, or a film that holds something painful without resolving it. The encounter does not explain the pain. It does not promise that the pain was necessary. But afterward the pain can feel different, not because it has been justified, but because it has been held with some kind of steady attention. Nietzsche is not reducing art to therapy. He is asking whether that kind of attention can amount to a form of life, rather than a form of entertainment. That question matters because it opens something Schopenhauer closes. For Schopenhauer, art at its best offers relief from striving, a temporary quieting of the will. For Nietzsche, art at its most powerful can show what it is to live with terrible things without retreating from them. That is a different relationship to suffering, not rescue from it, not an alibi for it. Something closer to fidelity to the fact of it. And fidelity is worth taking seriously as a concept here. To remain faithful to an experience, to not translate it prematurely into something more manageable, is itself a form of respect for what actually happened. Nietzsche's tragic instinct, at its core, is about fidelity rather than endurance. The Dionysian dimension should not be softened. Nietzsche is not saying tragic art politely acknowledges difficulty before returning to order. The Dionysian moment is genuinely frightening. It dissolves boundaries. It exposes the self to something larger and less controllable than the neat individual. That dissolution can be horrifying, but Nietzsche thinks it can also be the basis for an affirmation that does not depend on pretending life is safer than it is. The Apollonian form does not make the Dionysian darkness comfortable. It makes it endurable enough to witness. There is also something important in the question of what tragedy refuses. It refuses to make suffering private. Tragic suffering is public, witnessed, given shape, and brought into a shared space. The person who suffers alone in silence, without any form to hold the experience, has nothing to return to. Tragedy suggests that forms of attention, whether in art, in community, in language, in ritual, can make suffering visible in a way that does not immediately demand it explain itself. That is not a small thing to discover. It is the beginning of a different relationship to the hard parts of existence. Nietzsche is not saying that you should attend more theatre. He is pointing at a capacity, the capacity to remain with the terrible without immediately needing it to be translated into meaning, lesson, or indictment. If that capacity can be cultivated, if there is a form of seeing that can hold suffering in view without immediately prosecuting life for containing it, then Schopenhauer's verdict becomes less automatic. Life has not been solved, but it has been seen differently. There is also the question of what this implies about time. Tragic seeing does not demand that suffering be resolved before the seeing is honest. It allows suffering to exist in the present tense, without forcing it into a past tense narrative, where it finally made sense, or a future tense narrative where it will eventually be redeemed. That is actually a more demanding relationship with suffering than either consolation or condemnation. Consolation moves suffering into a frame where it belongs. Condemnation moves suffering into a judgment where it proves something. Tragic seeing holds suffering in the present and asks whether you can remain with it without either move. The practical question this raises, whether a person can actually live this way rather than merely admire the idea of it, is one Nietzsche does not try to settle with tragedy alone. Tragedy shows a possibility. It shows that the Greeks had a form of art and culture that could sustain this way of seeing. It does not tell us how to do it as individuals in ordinary life, without the chorus, without the stage, without the cultural forms that made tragic seeing communally available. That gap is part of why Nietzsche's later work, on recurrence, Amor, Fati, and affirmation, tries to find something that can work within a single life rather than only in a collective artistic form. But tragedy does something that the rest of Nietzsche's thought needs. It shows that the move he is asking for is not impossible. Some people in some times have been able to look at the terrible without immediately demanding that it be either justified or condemned. That historical fact matters. It means the capacity is real, even if it is difficult, even if Nietzsche cannot guarantee its availability. So the pressure is now clearer. Suffering has become a verdict. Schopenhauer has made that verdict serious by showing how unrest belongs to willing itself. Tragedy has shown one way of remaining with the terrible without immediately turning it into a condemnation of existence. We have moved from suffering as event, through suffering as philosophical accusation, to the question of whether existence can be faced clearly without being condemned. What comes next is harder. Seeing the terrible is not the same as enduring it, and most of us cannot stay with suffering for long without asking what it means. The hunger for meaning is where Nietzsche thinks the deepest trouble begins. You can feel how quickly the mind starts working once the first shock passes. Something painful happens, and almost at once the inner sorting begins. Is this punishment? Is this a lesson? Is this random? Is this how life reveals what matters? Even silence can become an interpretation, because a person may decide that the silence itself proves the universe as empty or indifferent. That quick movement tells us something embarrassing and human. We do not merely want pain to end, we want it placed. We want to know what sort of world we are in now that this has happened. Meaning does not arrive as decoration afterward. It often arrives as a survival instinct. You can hear it in the way people talk after very different kinds of suffering. One person says there must be a reason. Another says there is no reason, and that is the horror. A third says the event revealed who their real friends are. A fourth says it showed the world was never safe to begin with. All of them are doing more than reporting emotion. They are interpreting existence. Nietzsche's suspicion begins there. The story we tell ourselves about suffering does not stay local. It quietly reaches outward. It tells us what bodies are, what time is for, whether desire can be trusted, whether life has value on its own, whether redemption must lie elsewhere. The interpretation gives us footing, and at the same time it teaches us how to judge the ground we are standing on. That is why two meanings can console in equally powerful ways while pointing in opposite moral directions. One person may say this suffering taught me tenderness toward others. Another may say this suffering proved life is a bad arrangement. Both have found meaning. The question is, what sort of life each meaning now imagines, and it is worth saying that meaningless suffering really can feel worse. Not morally worse, more naked. A pain with no place can make a person feel dropped out of the world. Nietzsche knows that, which is why his critique never works as a smug instruction to stop searching for reasons. The search is too bound up with ordinary human endurance, so the issue is not whether we interpret, we will. The issue is what those interpretations ask us to love, hate, distrust, or wait for once they settle in. There is a point where pain without a reason can feel almost harder to bear than pain itself. The body suffers, but the mind suffers again when it cannot place the event anywhere. Not in justice, not in punishment, not in growth, not in fate, not in a plan, not even in a clear absurdity. Bare pain can feel like a second exposure. It is not only happening, it is happening without a place. That is why human beings reach for meaning so quickly. The reach is not decorative. It is often the thing that keeps a person from collapse. If suffering can be placed inside a story, then the story gives posture, expectation, and direction. Now I know what this means. Now I know what is being asked of me. Now I know whether to endure, repent, hope, wait, fight, submit, or change. Nietzsche understands that need far better than people sometimes assume. He does not laugh at the sufferer for wanting meaning. A person in pain may need an interpretation simply to survive the next hour. Meaning gathers the scattered fragments of experience and makes them livable enough to carry. But meaning is never just soothing, it also interprets the world. It tells us what kind of reality this is, whether the body can be trusted, whether desire is lower or dangerous, whether time is redemptive, whether this life has value on its own or only through some order beyond it. The same interpretation that steadies a person can quietly teach them to despise the terms on which life is actually lived. Imagine two people struck by the same loss. One is told that nothing about it means anything. The other is told that the suffering belongs to a larger order, perhaps a test, perhaps a purification, perhaps a debt, perhaps a preparation, perhaps the difficult path toward a truer self. The second person may endure much more easily. Their pain has become legible. But what has the story asked them to believe about life in order to become helpful? That is the double edge Nietzsche wants to expose. A meaning can save the sufferer while placing value elsewhere. It can make this life bearable by implying that this life is not enough. It can rescue the will at the cost of teaching suspicion toward body, desire, chance, finitude, or the earth. This is why the hunger for meaning is not a side issue. It is one of the deepest ways suffering turns from an event into a philosophy. The interpretation does not only answer the pain, it answers the question of what kind of life this is. Often it answers by introducing a hidden comparison, a better order, a purer state, a truer world, a version of life in which the suffering would either disappear or finally become justified. We can see the same structure in more modern forms. This made me stronger. This taught me who I really am. This had to happen so I could become the person I am now. Those lines are not always dishonest. Sometimes they are the most honest language a person can find, but they carry a risk. The event starts to look necessary because the later meaning depends on it. Pain becomes retroactively vindicated. That is one reason Nietzsche remains suspicious even of self-created meaning. It is not enough to say that meaning is made rather than found. Created meaning can still condemn life. If the story says that only a life purified of vulnerability would be acceptable, then we have merely built the courtroom ourselves and called it personal growth. The psychological pressure here is enormous because no meaning at all can feel worse than a hard meaning. Better guilt than chaos, better punishment than nothing, better a severe order than a shapeless wound. This is part of the ground under Nietzsche's later claim that human beings would rather will nothingness than not will. A harsh interpretation can still preserve orientation. The absence of interpretation can feel like spiritual disintegration. That is why the question cannot be answered by telling people to stop looking for meaning. The search is too deep for that. The real question is what kind of interpretation preserves human life without turning against life? Can suffering be given shape without being used to condemn existence? Can pain be made bearable without teaching the sufferer that reality must apologize for being finite? Communities become powerful here as well. Once suffering has a shared meaning, it becomes communicable. It can join one person to others who recognize the same language, the same ritual, the same hope, the same moral order. Nietzsche does not ignore that strength. He asks what those communities have agreed to value in exchange for the comfort they provide. A community that survives by teaching contempt for the body, for earthly time, for ordinary human desire, may have purchased solidarity at a steep price. The kinds of meanings that travel most easily through communities are the ones that provide both explanation and orientation. They tell you not only what your suffering means, but what you are supposed to do with it. Repent, purify, wait, protest, overcome, transcend. The directive is part of the meaning, and the directive almost always points towards something. Usually it points away from what is directly present. Often it points toward a condition in which the current life would be justified, surpassed, or finally made whole. That is the structural move Nietzsche wants to slow down. Not because grief should be left without any framework, but because every framework carries a valuation, and the valuation may already have decided that this life, as actually given, in bodies, in time, in contingency, in loss, is not sufficient to stand on its own. Think about the specific stories that accumulate around any major loss in a life. The story of punishment implies that the sufferer did something to deserve this, which carries a valuation of desert and moral order. The story of refinement implies that suffering makes the sufferer better, which carries a valuation that places the improved future self above the present injured one. The story of sacrifice implies that the loss serves something larger, which places the something larger above this life. The story of absurdity implies that suffering proves the universe is indifferent, which carries its own verdict on existence. Each interpretation does real psychological work, and each carries a valuation that Nietzsche thinks deserves examination. There is also a temporal dimension to how meaning-making works that Nietzsche notices. Most meanings for suffering work by postponing the resolution. The meaning will be clear later. The purpose will become visible once more time has passed. The growth will be evident when the process is complete. That postponement is not always dishonest, but it does something specific. It places the value of the present suffering in a future that has not yet arrived, which means the present suffering, in its raw state, remains devalued. The sufferer is asked to endure the present by borrowing value from a future that may or may not deliver on the loan. Nietzsche is attentive to this borrowing because it matters for how life is valued. If suffering is bearable mainly because of what it will eventually produce, then life as it is actually being experienced right now, the life that includes the suffering, remains on probation. It has not been affirmed, it has been tolerated in expectation. The affirmation, if it ever arrives, will be for the redeemed life, not for the life that had to be lived before the redemption. That is a subtle but real form of life denial, even in secular self-improvement narratives that have no metaphysical content. So the hunger for meaning stands at a dangerous threshold. It can save, it can orient, it can keep the will alive, and it can become the place where consolation teaches contempt for the very life it claims to redeem. That is why Nietzsche's next move is not to reject meaning altogether, but to study one of the strongest historical machines for giving pain a reason. He calls that machine the ascetic ideal. You can picture the moment this problem belongs to. Someone is hurting, and another person arrives with an explanation that makes the hurting easier to carry. Maybe it is religious, maybe it is moral, maybe it is a family sentence you have heard since childhood. This happened to teach you something. This is a test. This is part of a plan. This is the price of becoming who you need to become. This suffering is not pointless. When words like that land at the right moment, they do not feel stupid, they feel like water. A few minutes earlier, the pain had no place to go. It was just there, heavy and shapeless. Now it has a track. Now the mind can move. It can repent, endure, obey, hope, purify itself. Offer the pain up, wait for an answer, or imagine a better condition beyond the present one. Nietzsche understands why that feels merciful. He is not dealing in the cheap superiority of someone who has never needed a reason to keep going. He knows that a person can be steadied by an interpretation before they are ever convinced by it. Sometimes the interpretation is the only thing preventing blank collapse. That is why he takes the ascetic ideal so seriously. It is one of history's great machines for giving pain a reason. The language changes with the setting. In one place, suffering is punishment. In another, it is purification. In another, it is discipline. In another, it is spiritual proof. In another, it is the narrow road toward a truer self. But the structure stays familiar. Pain is placed inside an order, and the order tells the sufferer what their pain is for. That can preserve a life. If you have ever watched someone grab hold of a harsh explanation because the alternative felt like falling into a hole, you already know why. Better a severe meaning than none. Better to think the pain asks something of me than to think it says nothing at all. Nietzsche does not sneer at that instinct. He asks what the instinct purchases. The purchase, very often, is a quiet suspicion of life itself. The body becomes morally risky. Desire starts looking lower than restraint. Pleasure requires a defense. Instinct needs supervision. Earthly existence becomes something that can be tolerated only if it points beyond itself toward a purer scale. You can hear the structure even in modern secular speech. Hardship made me who I am. Pain refined me. The loss happened so I could become stronger. Suffering separated the real from the fake. These lines are not identical, and they are not always false, but they all lean in the same direction. This life becomes bearable by being linked to some higher condition that finally explains it. That is why Nietzsche's figure of the ascetic priest matters. The priest is not simply a villain in robes. He is the human specialist in redirection. He meets raw suffering and gives it a name. He does not remove the wound. He turns the wound into guilt, duty, discipline, hope, obedience, sacrifice, or moral seriousness. The pain becomes governable because it no longer floats. Think about how powerful that is in ordinary life. Someone loses a relationship and is told the loss revealed their true path. Someone gets sick and starts seeing the illness as a purification. Someone fails publicly and converts the humiliation into a proof that they are being remade for a greater purpose. These stories can genuinely save people from disintegration. Nietzsche never misses that. You can also watch the same mechanism form in much smaller rooms. A child grows up hearing that every hard thing was sent for a reason. Years later, as an adult, they repeat the sentence automatically when their own life breaks. Or someone learns in a severe family that pain is respectable only when it produces discipline. So when grief comes, they immediately begin looking for the lesson, because bare grief feels almost illegitimate. They are not choosing a theory from a shelf. They are reaching for the only shape of suffering that feels livable. That is part of why the ascetic ideal lasts so long. It does not arrive as an abstract doctrine first. It arrives as a habit of translating pain into duty. Do not waste this hurt. Do not let the loss be meaningless. Become worthy of what happened. Those commands can sound noble. they can also keep a person from feeling what has actually happened to them, because the pain has to start working before it is allowed to simply exist. What troubles Nietzsche is the hidden valuation inside the rescue. The rescue keeps working because ordinary embodied life has already been downgraded. The visible world is not enough. Bodily desire is not enough. Finite time is not enough. This life can only be endured if it can be translated into another ledger, and once that ledger is in place, certain kinds of suffering become easier for a culture to admire than others. Clean suffering, productive suffering, suffering that matures, purifies, instructs, or deepens. But suffering that merely confuses, weakens, or leaves someone less capable tends to embarrass us. We do not know how to praise it. We do not even know how to look at it for very long. So the pressure returns: make it mean something higher, or it will seem unbearable and almost improper. That is the bite of his most severe line here. Human beings would rather will nothingness than not will. In other words, they may prefer a purpose that quietly turns against life, to the feeling that life has no purpose at all. A harsh meaning can be easier to bear than meaninglessness. Even self-denial can feel like relief if it saves the will from blankness. You can hear the line more concretely if you imagine the alternative. A person says, "This happened, it hurts, and I cannot yet say what it is for." That sentence is honest, but it leaves them without rails. Vanart, as the poets of Uwe Mosensedens, Phonarsis, but it leaves them without rails. The ascetic ideal offers rails immediately. Here is your duty. Here is your purification. Here is the reason you must continue. Nietzsche understands the emotional force of that offer. His objection is not that people are foolish for taking it. His objection is that the offer often teaches them to distrust the very texture of finite life while it is saving them. And you can see this far beyond theology. A culture can lose its religion and keep the same grammar. Pain still has to reveal something. Hardship still has to prove character. Ease still feels faintly suspicious. Suffering that leads nowhere still looks lesser than suffering that teaches a lesson. The old structure survives inside new language. This is one reason modern self-improvement talk can feel strangely moralistic even when it sounds practical. It inherits the older demand that pain justify itself. If the pain produces discipline, wisdom, status, purity, resilience, or a stronger future self, then it can stay. If it merely hurts, if it leaves someone smaller, sadder, slower, or confused, then we do not know where to put it. We become embarrassed by suffering that refuses to become useful. Nietzsche wants to hold still on that embarrassment. Why should pain need to earn its keep before we allow it into the story of a worthy life? Why does purposeless suffering feel not only painful, but almost socially indecent? Because a long moral inheritance has trained us to need pain with a destination. Dos Voltiful Vimnes, that inheritance shapes whole cultures. People who suffer with a recognized meaning are often admired. They are brave, refined, deepened, spiritually serious. People who suffer without a story can look lost, pitiable, even vaguely suspect. Pain redeemed by a beyond is easier for a culture to look at than pain that simply remains pain. That is why Nietzsche's critique has to stay ambiguous if it is going to stay humane. If an ascetic interpretation kept someone alive, it would be crude to yank it away and call the result liberation. He is not writing instructions for what to say beside a hospital bed. He is tracing the moral world that forms when suffering becomes bearable only by teaching contempt for ordinary life. And the costs are not small. Once this grammar settles in, life starts looking guilty until it proves it serves another order. Pleasure becomes morally thin. Desire becomes a management problem. The body becomes a compromise. The earth becomes a lower station. A person may never say any of this out loud. They may still carry it in how they comfort themselves and judge others. The strange thing is that the ascetic ideal can even make people feel more alive. It can give them direction, stamina, purpose, intensity. That is part of why it lasted. It does not only produce sadness, it can produce focus, but the focus has been bought at a price. The conditions of embodied, finite, changing life have been ranked below whatever ideal redeems them. And what happens when the redeeming frame weakens? Nietzsche sees the danger there too. If suffering was survivable because it belonged to a larger order, and the order begins to lose credibility, the pain does not become easier, it becomes unmoored. Often the first result is not freedom, it is drift, exhaustion, a hard, flat sense that the old meanings were false but nothing sturdier has arrived to replace them. That is one path into nihilism. Not too much honesty at the start, too much inherited meaning collapsing at once. You can feel that in secular life now. Many people no longer believe the old redemptive stories in their older form, but they still cannot bear pain that means nothing. So the structure gets rebuilt in smaller ways. Trauma must become growth. Loss must become wisdom. Sacrifice must become identity. Burnout must reveal the truth about your calling. Every wound needs a lesson attached to it, because a wound without a lesson leaves us staring at life too directly. That is the turning point of this problem. Suffering is no longer only a private accusation against life. It has become organized. It has administrators, approved sayings, admired forms, and familiar emotional roots. The question is no longer just why pain hurts so much. The question is what kind of life is being judged every time pain is made meaningful by pointing beyond life. And once that question is visible, another fear comes into view. What if the inherited reasons stop working? What if the old beyond grows thin? Nietzsche knows that the collapse of consolation does not solve the problem of suffering. It only pushes the whole problem back into the open. That is exactly where he wants it before he brings in his hardest test. What if the one thing you most want left out could not be left out? That is the pressure eternal recurrence brings in, not first as a theory about the universe, as a question that corners you. A demon says this life, exactly this life, comes back again and again. Not only the parts you would keep, the delay you regret, the afternoon you wasted, the humiliation you still replay, the illness, the loss, the season you would erase if anyone gave you the chance. That is why the thought lands so hard. Most of us accept life with hidden conditions. At least this will pass. At least the worst part only happened once. At least time will carry it far enough away that I will not have to feel it as part of what I choose. Recurrence closes those exits one by one. Nietzsche is not trying to inspire you here. He is not saying, live boldly. He is not turning philosophy into urgency or productivity. He is taking the problem of suffering and tightening it until there is nowhere softer to stand. If nothing painful can be removed even in thought, what happens to your yes? And this question has to stay first person. You cannot lay it on somebody else without becoming cruel. You can only ask it of your own life. Would I will this again? Not life in general, not the beautiful pieces taken out and polished. This one. Would the part one still resist whenever memory touches it? That is where many people hear how conditional their ordinary affirmation really is. I accept my life, except for that. I would keep living, except if I had to keep that piece in it unchanged. Nietzsche is not catching you in hypocrisy. He is showing you the terms under which your consent has been operating. The thought is lonely too. No one is in the room with you when it arrives. No audience, no applause, no moral display. The demon asks what remains when you cannot borrow strength from being seen as brave. And because recurrence takes away compensation, it also sharpens Nietzsche's suspicion of consolation. If I can only bear life because I believe another world, another account, another future version of me will finally make the pain acceptable, recurrence exposes that bargain immediately. There is no later correction in the thought experiment. There is only this life returning with its full weight. That does not make the honest answer easy. For many people, the first answer is still no. Some losses remain almost impossible to will. Some injuries do not soften just because a philosopher has made them part of a test. Nietzsche does not wave that away. He wants the resistance to stay visible, because the resistance tells the truth about something, not about whether you are strong or weak. about the hidden terms on which you have agreed to life. If I need innocence, final compensation, or a past that can be mentally cleaned before I can consent, recurrence brings that need into the open. You can feel the everyday version of this without the demon language. Think how often acceptance depends on distance. That was a terrible year, but it is over. That belonged to an older self. Time has put glass around it. Recurrence removes the glass. It says the year is not sealed away. It stays inside the life you are being asked to will whole. That is why recurrence is so severe. It does not ask whether you can appreciate life in general. It asks whether you can stop relating to your own past as a draft that should have been edited before you agreed to sign it. It also cuts directly against the ascetic hope we just traced. The ascetic ideal says suffering is a passage. Endure this, and it leads beyond itself. Recurrence removes the beyond. There is no final correction waiting on the far side. The passage does not open into another world. It returns as part of this one that changes the pressure completely. The question is no longer whether the pain can be redeemed later. The question is whether the life containing the pain can be claimed now. Without that promise, there is something almost surgical in that. Nietzsche is not telling you what reality is. He is using the thought to expose your private bargain with reality. Maybe the bargain is simple: I will live, but I refuse to call that part mine. Recurrence asks whether the refusal can survive once the whole must be willed together. It also makes time heavier. Usually time helps because it lets us think the worst moment is passing out of relevance. Recurrence refuses that comfort. Nothing passes out. Nothing is filed away for good. What happened keeps belonging to the whole shape. Think about the ordinary ways we protect ourselves from the full weight of a life. We say that was another chapter. We say I am not that person anymore. We say the worst part is behind me, so it no longer defines what this life is. Sometimes those sentences are healthy. Sometimes they are the only way to get up in the morning. Recurrence does not let them function as final shelter. It keeps pressing the same point. Even what is behind you still belongs to what you are being asked to affirm. That is why the thought can feel almost offensive at first contact. It seems to deny one of the few mercies time gives us. But Nietzsche is not trying to confiscate mercy. He is trying to discover whether our mercy depends on mentally amputating pieces of life before we can agree to keep living it. That is why this thought cannot be reduced to a slogan about living with no regrets. Regret is only part of it. The deeper issue is whether your yes to life depends on being allowed to treat some of your life as if it does not truly count. And there is another layer. Recurrence does not only return disaster, it returns repetition. The small exhaustion, the same fear on Tuesday morning, the same argument in your own head, the same hour of feeling cut off from other people while the world looks normal from outside. Nietzsche makes the test severe partly because life is not only wounded by great events, it is worn by recurrence already. The thought experiment simply forces us to notice how much of our consent depends on assuming repetition can be escaped. By making the test almost unbearable, recurrence protects affirmation from becoming cheap. A shallow yes can survive only while it stays general. Recurrence drags the yes toward the one place it does not want to go, so recurrence is not the solution. It is the stripping down of the problem. It removes compensation, postponement, rescue, and the comfort of saying at least that part is over. What remains is the question of whether a life that includes suffering can be willed whole. Nietzsche's next word for that possibility is not acceptance. There is a further cruelty in the test that is easy to miss. Recurrence asks about the whole life, but a human being usually meets life in fragments. Tonight's anxiety, this particular memory, the one face that will not leave, the task is therefore not to leap into a magnificent total yes. It is to see how the fragment quietly claims authority over the whole. A single pain becomes a spokesman for existence. A single hour says, "This is what life is." Nietzsche's thought breaks that spell by refusing to let the fragment speak alone. Not because the fragment is false, but because it is partial. The life is larger than the wound, and also not separable from it. That double truth is what makes recurrence so hard. If the wound alone defines the life, affirmation becomes impossible. If the wound is simply ignored, affirmation becomes dishonest. Recurrence permits neither simplification. This is why the question is not whether you can become cheerful about repetition. Cheerfulness would be too small for the problem. The question is whether your relation to the painful part can change without requiring that the part disappear. That is a different kind of pressure. It does not ask the sufferer to smile at the demon. It asks whether the demon has exposed the condition under which life was being accepted. And sometimes the first honest answer is simply, not yet. That answer matters. It keeps Nietzsche from becoming a doctrine of instant severity. A real life may need time before it can even ask the question without violence. The point is not to force a yes before the soul can breathe. The point is to understand why the yes, if it ever comes, cannot be purchased by pretending the no was never there. It is Amor Fati. This is where many readers reach for the soft translation. Accept what you cannot control. Make peace with the past. Trust reality a little more. Those phrases may help in ordinary life. They are still gentler than what Nietzsche means by Amor Fati. Amor Fati does not mean call the wound good. It does not mean stop naming injustice. It does not mean tell another person that their suffering was necessary. The moment the phrase starts doing that work, it becomes dangerous. Nietzsche's question is harsher and more private. Can you say yes to your own life without first demanding another past? Can you claim the life whole instead of only the version that would have pleased your sense of what should have happened? Most of us already carry quiet edits. If only that year were gone. If only that betrayal were not in the foundation. If only I could keep what I became and cut out the price by which I became it. That wish is ordinary because it feels humane. Of course, we would rather have arrived here without damage. Nietzsche's pressure is that a full yes cannot easily live alongside that wish. If the self you are claiming was formed through the whole sequence, then mentally revoking a central part of the sequence fractures the affirmation. The life is being accepted with conditions attached. That is why Amor Fati is not serenity. It is not mainly a mood at all. It is the willingness to stop bargaining with the life you have. Not because every event deserves blessing, because your life is not separable from the road by which it became itself, and the distinction matters. You can still say this harm was wrong, this cruelty should be condemned, this person was responsible. Nietzsche does not erase those judgments. The harder question begins after them. Can I still say yes to the life containing those facts as part of its irreversible shape? That is also why Amor Fati must not be confused with passivity. Nietzsche is not telling anyone to stop resisting injustice. He is not saying public wrongs should be accepted as fate. He is asking a different question, one about how a person relates to the totality of their own existence. Even so, the danger does not disappear. Beside actual injury, love your fate can sound unbearable. It can sound like a polished demand for gratitude toward what damaged you. A serious reading has to admit that risk, rather than pretending better definitions, make it vanish. Still, Nietzsche keeps pressing because he thinks a yes that depends on cutting away the unwelcome parts does not belong to your life. It belongs to an imaginary revision. Amor Fati says the real question has to include exactly what you most want excluded. You can hear a weaker version of this in ordinary speech. People sometimes say, I would not change anything because it made me who I am. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is defensive. Sometimes it is the closest they can get to owning their history without collapsing into regret. Nietzsche wants something stricter than self-congratulation. Not did the pain make you impressive. Can you refuse resentment toward the terms on which your life became yours? That word resentment matters. Grief is not the same thing. Grief keeps faith with what mattered. Resentment keeps replaying the demand that reality should have honored a contract it never signed. Nietzsche thinks that second movement often hides inside our strongest objections to suffering, so Amor Fati would not mean giving up grief. It would mean loosening the demand that life had to become something else before you would consent to it. And that helps explain the word love. Acceptance can still keep its distance. I accept that this happened, but I recoil from it. I accept reality, but only while standing back from it. Love is harsher because it refuses that safe distance, not tenderness toward each event. Refusal to hold your own life at arm's length like a draft you never approved. That refusal is difficult because revision feels morally intelligent to us. We admire the person who can say clearly and angrily that life should have been fairer than this. Sometimes that anger sees well. Sometimes it becomes a permanent tribunal in which existence is always guilty for failing to resemble a purified ideal. Nietzsche wants to know whether someone can leave that tribunal without becoming morally numb. You can feel how hard that is in very ordinary memory. There are moments people replay not because they enjoy pain, but because replaying keeps alive the sense that reality owes them a different version. If I keep returning to it, I keep the protest active. I keep saying this should not be part of my life. Nietzsche is not mocking that protest. He is asking whether a life can ever be inhabited wholly, while that inner refusal remains the deepest voice in it. He does not fully settle that. Amor Fati is not a technique he hands over with instructions. It is a horizon. It measures how far affirmation would have to go if it were to survive the problem of suffering. And it is intimate in a frightening way. It asks whether you can inhabit your own life without preserving one secret pocket of refusal. Many people survive by keeping that pocket. Nietzsche is asking what it would mean to let even that close. That is also why Amor Fati is more severe than courage. Courage can still mean facing what you privately reject. Amor Fati pushes towards something else, not merely bearing the life you were given, but ceasing to hold yourself apart from it, as though you were the reviewer of a book that should have been revised before publication. That image sounds almost simple. In practice, it may be one of the hardest demands Nietzsche ever makes. If that sounds dangerous, it is, which is why the next step cannot become admiration too quickly. The moment the yes grows strong, it risks becoming cruel. It is worth lingering here because this is the point where readers either become careless or turn away. Careless readers hear affirmation and think they have found something grand and bracing. Turn-away readers hear it and think the whole philosophy has become inhuman. Both reactions make sense. Neither is enough. The reason both reactions make sense is simple. The language really is dangerous. Want nothing different. Love your fate. Say yes to the whole. These are not mild sentences. Next to extreme suffering, they can sound almost indecent. That is why a serious reading has to keep asking, who is speaking, to whom, and under what conditions? Nietzsche's strongest thoughts break the moment they become advice thrown at the wounded from a safe distance. The only place they can even begin without rotting is in first-person confrontation. What do I mean when I reject my own life at this point? What standard am I protecting? What would I be saying yes to? And what would I still need to keep morally condemned? That inner discipline matters because without it, affirmation slides into performance. A person starts trying to look like someone who can say yes. They admire themselves for being severe, evolved, uncompromising. At that point, Nietzsche has been turned into theatre again, just in a different form. There is also a cruelty hidden in admiration. Once saying yes looks noble, those who cannot say it begin to look spiritually lesser. Their grief seems weaker, their protest seems immature, their inability to affirm becomes one more wound laid on top of the first one. That is not a misuse from the outside only. It can happen inside a person's own self-talk too. So the argument has to keep the warning alive. A philosophy of affirmation can become one more instrument for punishing the injured. That is not a side risk, it is built into the terrain. And yet the warning does not finish the argument, because Nietzsche still sees another risk on the opposite side. A refusal of affirmation can remain tied to ideals of purity, safety and compensation that no earthly life could satisfy, which means even the refusal may be carrying a hidden metaphysics. So we stay in the tension, not because tension is elegant, because any clean resolution here would probably be dishonest. This is the point where suspicion of Nietzsche becomes not only understandable but necessary. If someone hears yes to life and immediately thinks yes to what exactly, that is the right question. Not yes to weather or inconvenience, not yes to one embarrassing year, yes to betrayal, to violence, to irreversible illness, to grief that rewrites a family, to injustice that should have been stopped before it became part of anyone's biography. The question tests whether affirmation can be brought near real harm without collapsing into obscenity. A weak reading of Nietzsche tries to reassure us too quickly. It says, "Do not worry, he only means attitude, not actual suffering." Or it says he only wants courage, not approval. Those clarifications matter, but they do not dissolve the problem. The texture of the language itself remains dangerous. Love your fate, want nothing different, say yes to the whole. Beside certain experiences, that language does not sound noble, it sounds intolerable. The first danger is moral confusion. If affirmation of the whole is heard as approval of each part, then cruelty enters immediately. A person who has suffered grave harm is now invited to reinterpret the harm as somehow fitting, necessary, or spiritually desirable. That is not a deep philosophy, it is a catastrophe of judgment. The second danger is social. Once affirmation becomes admirable, people who cannot affirm may be seen as lesser. Endurance hardens into a hierarchy. The person crushed by pain begins to look spiritually inferior to the person who can still say yes. Nietzsche's thought can be used that way, and it often has been. Any honest reading has to say so. There is a third danger too. Affirmation can become an alibi for those who benefit from the suffering of others. If life as a whole is to be affirmed, then perhaps existing arrangements become easier to excuse. Perhaps protest starts sounding petty compared to a grand yes to becoming, struggle and reality. That political misuse is not hypothetical. It is one reason the philosophy must be handled with discipline. Nietzsche's strongest defense is a distinction, but it is a difficult distinction to keep alive. Affirming a life as a whole is not the same act as morally endorsing each event within it. One can say this harm was wrong, this person was culpable, this injustice should have been resisted, and still ask whether the life containing those things can be claimed without reserve. The distinction is coherent. The problem is that real lives do not separate the levels easily. A wound is not only an abstract event within a totality, it is something a person remembers in detail, something they may still carry in their body, something that may have narrowed their future permanently. Asking for affirmation at the level of the whole can therefore sound like erasing the level at which the harm remains burning. Nietzsche never fully solves that tension. That is one reason the argument must keep the problem open. Some philosophies are improved by clarification. This one is improved by refusing cheap clarification. The danger is not a misunderstanding that disappears once we define terms well enough. The danger belongs to the material itself. A yes strong enough to answer recurrence will always risk sounding like a yes too far. And yet the opposite danger remains in force too. If consolation redeems suffering only by teaching us to despise life, then refusing affirmation is not morally innocent either. We are caught between risks. One risk is that saying yes becomes cruelty. The other is that saying no becomes a hidden loyalty to standards that life could never satisfy without ceasing to be life. Nietzsche lives inside that tension rather than beyond it. That is why he is more interesting and less safe than the popular readings allow. He does not offer a moral formula that can be applied without remainder. He asks whether the deepest objection to suffering is really an objection to life or an objection to fragility, contingency, embodiment and time. But the asking itself can press too hard on the wounded. The practical consequence is that affirmation cannot become an instruction you hand to others. It can only remain a question a person asks of their own life, under conditions of humility. The moment it becomes a slogan directed outward, you should love your fate, you should stop resisting, you should be grateful for your pain, the philosophy has already started rotting. There is something important in that limit. Nietzsche's harshest thoughts are first-person tests, not public commandments. eternal recurrence, Amor, Fati, the question of affirmation, all of them become ethically distorted if they are used to judge another person's visible suffering from the outside. This is not a small correction. It changes the moral atmosphere completely. It also means affirmation cannot do the work of justice. A parent burying a child does not need to be asked whether they can affirm the whole. A worker crushed by exploitation does not need a sermon about loving fate. A person harmed by another person's cruelty does not need philosophy used as a way of closing the case. Nietzsche's question may still matter in those lives, but only from within, and only if it arrives without trying to silence protest or cancel responsibility. Even so, the tension remains because self-address is not morally neutral either. A person can tyrannize themselves with Nietzsche. They can turn affirmation into an impossible demand, a way of feeling inadequate not only for their pain, but for their inability to transfigure the pain into a grand yes. That is another contemporary distortion. Nietzsche becomes a new superego, harsher than the religious ones he critiques. That self-tyranny has a recognizable tone. I should be above this by now. I should be able to say yes. I should be stronger than my own resistance. The old moral language disappears, but the punishment remains. Nietzsche is useful only if he makes that punishment more visible, not if he gives it a sharper vocabulary. The thought is safer when it stays diagnostic. What does my resistance reveal about the conditions under which I accept life? That question can open reflection. The moment it becomes a performance standard, a test of whether I am strong enough, evolved enough, philosophical enough, it has slipped back into a form of punishment, so the argument leaves us in a deliberately unstable place. Saying yes may be magnificent, it may be impossible, it may be morally compromised, it may be all three at once. Nietzsche does not get to escape those difficulties by speaking more forcefully, but the difficulties do not erase his suspicion of consolation. They only force us to examine consolation more carefully. If comfort so often asks us to relocate value beyond life, then the humane tone of consolation may hide a harsh judgment of existence all its own. That is where consolation itself comes under trial. One reason consolation is so hard to question is that it often arrives wearing kindness. It comes in a lowered voice. It comes at funerals. It comes in late-night phone calls. It comes from people trying, sincerely, to keep another person from falling apart. If Nietzsche is going to put consolation on trial, he has to do it without forgetting that human need. That is what makes his suspicion so uncomfortable. He is not exposing a fraud that no one needed anyway. He is examining one of the most cherished human responses to suffering. And the examination matters because consolation often does two things at once. It helps the sufferer remain standing, and it teaches them where value supposedly really lies. Sometimes that hidden lesson is gentle. This world is not the final one. This wound is not the truest thing about you. This life is not the whole story. Sometimes it is secular. The future healed self is the real destination. The lesson will justify the pain. The growth will redeem the loss. What links those forms is not tone but direction. Value is placed somewhere else, and the present becomes bearable by leaning toward it. That can feel compassionate because it really does help many people endure. But Nietzsche hears the cost. The life being lived now becomes secondary. The exposed, finite, vulnerable life here on earth becomes something to get through, explain, transcend, or cash in for another condition. And once that habit settles in, the judgment against life becomes easier to understand. Of course, this life seems inadequate. Consolation has been teaching that lesson all along, even while trying to soothe us. This is why Nietzsche's target is not tenderness itself, a hand on the shoulder, a room shared with someone who will not explain your pain away, a sentence that says, "I am here." None of that necessarily devalues life. In some cases, it may be the most faithful response available. What he distrusts is explanatory comfort that saves this life by quietly ranking another life above it. That distinction matters because otherwise Nietzsche sounds like an enemy of care. He is not. He is an enemy of care that can survive only by telling us that reality, as lived here, is not worthy enough to be the place where value stays. Most people do not first meet consolation as a theory. They meet it as a sentence spoken in the right tone at the right moment. A parent after a death, a friend during the long walk after a collapse, a religious voice at a funeral, a secular voice after disappointment. The words vary, but the movement is familiar. This hurts, yes, but the real answer is not fully here. The final meaning lies somewhere beyond what you are presently enduring. Nietzsche does not sneer at that need. A person in pain may need words that hold them together. If philosophy responds with contempt, it has already failed the human situation it claims to understand. The issue is not whether comfort is needed. The issue is what kind of world the comfort silently asks us to inhabit. The strongest consolations usually work by relocating the good. The permanent is more real than the passing. The spiritual is higher than the bodily. The lasting self matters more than the wounded present self. The future redeemed state matters more than the present torn one. In each case, the suffering becomes bearable by being measured against something supposedly truer than the life in which the suffering occurs. That can be effective. It can save people. It can keep them from dissolving into despair. Nietzsche takes that effectiveness seriously, but he hears another sentence hidden inside the comfort. This life, as lived here, is not enough. It is too contingent, too bodily, too changing, too vulnerable to carry final value on its own. That hidden sentence matters because it teaches the standard by which life will later be judged. If the true good is what does not suffer loss, then a life built from exposure to loss already appears lower. If the true home is beyond ordinary time, then a life inside time appears like a waiting room. If true value belongs to the purified self or world, then this embodied, desiring, perishable life is already on trial before the suffering even arrives. You can hear how early that lesson starts. Children are taught that the real treasure cannot be taken away. Adults say the material world is not what matters most. Therapists, teachers, pastors, parents and friends, all in different ways, may imply that the healed version of you is more truly you than the one who is breaking right now. Again, the point is not that these voices are malicious. The point is that they teach us to look past the present life in order to save it. That is why Nietzsche's critique of consolation is not a celebration of cruelty. He is not saying stop comforting each other. He is saying notice when comfort works by quietly devaluing the life it comforts. Notice when relief depends on placing worth somewhere other than where the person is actually living. And notice how different presence feels from explanation. A person sits beside you and says nothing clever, but stays. That can be a consolation too. It does not solve the metaphysical problem. It does not tell you what the pain is for, but it also does not require that this life be measured against another life before it can be held. Nietzsche's suspicion leaves room for that kind of nearness, even while he remains hard on explanatory rescue. This extends far beyond formal religion. Secular lives do the same thing constantly. The better future self becomes the new heaven, recovery becomes salvation, healing becomes the promised land in whose name the present suffering is tolerated. None of that is automatically false or manipulative. The structure is the issue. Value gets borrowed from elsewhere so that the present can be endured. We can feel the psychological force of that borrowing because it solves a real problem. Present suffering often feels unbearable precisely because it is present. To imagine a later state in which it will make sense, be overcome, or become proportionate, is to receive a rope thrown from another time. Nietzsche's suspicion is not that the rope works. It is that the rope may train us to treat the present life as spiritually inferior to the imagined future. The gentlest version of this says, "Someday you will understand." The harshest version says, "Only beyond this life will things truly be set right." Between those poles lie countless secular forms. One day the trauma will be integrated, one day the stronger self will appear, one day the experience will be redeemed by what it taught. These sentences differ in tone, but each can ask the sufferer to endure the present by leaning on a life not yet lived. There is something humane in that, and something dangerous. The humane part is obvious. People survive because they can imagine a future they cannot yet inhabit. The danger is subtler. If the present matters mainly as the price of that future, then the present remains unaffirmed. It remains something to get through rather than something that can stand before value in its own right. Nietzsche thinks this is one of the deepest habits of a consoling culture. We learn to value life in proportion to how far it approaches what does not wound. That means suffering does not merely hurt, it becomes evidence of distance from the higher order. Life seems guilty because it is not enough like the thing consolation taught us to trust. This is why consolation becomes a kind of tribunal. It does not only soothe the sufferer, it also educates judgment. It teaches us what a worthy world would look like, and that lesson is often learned most deeply by those who most need comfort. Later, when suffering returns, the judgment against life sounds natural. It sounds like honesty. In fact, it is speaking a language it inherited. There is also an ethical complication here. Some consolations are relational rather than doctrinal. A friend says, "I am here, you are not alone. This will not always feel exactly like this." Those are also forms of comfort, but they do not necessarily relocate value beyond life. Nietzsche's sharpest critique aims at consolations that redeem suffering by measuring it against another order. A humane life probably depends on consolations of presence more than on consolations of metaphysical explanation. That distinction is worth keeping because otherwise Nietzsche can sound like he is against tenderness itself. He is not. He is against a type of tenderness that can be sustained only by teaching contempt for the world of bodies, desire, change, and death. The critique, at its best, tries to protect a form of closeness to life, rather than abolish care. Still, the pull of metaphysical consolation remains strong because presence does not answer the why question. A hand on the shoulder may help someone endure the night. It does not explain why the night had to happen. Explanatory consolation answers that demand more directly, and that is why it remains so powerful even for people who distrust its content. Human beings often want a world they can intellectually forgive, not only a world they can emotionally survive. Nietzsche is radical precisely because he questions that desire for intellectual forgiveness. What if the demand that life justify itself on painless terms is already the problem? What if the need for a final answer trains us to reject the world in order to survive it? Those questions are not easy to live with, which is why many readers prefer a simpler Nietzsche, one who gives strength, grit, and usable slogans. But those simplified versions have to be cleared away because they evade the actual difficulty rather than confronting it. You can hear the flattening almost immediately whenever Nietzsche gets dragged into self-help language. Pain becomes fuel, hardship becomes branding, eternal recurrence becomes a productivity poster, Amor Fati becomes a wellness mantra, will to power becomes personal optimization. The result is a version of Nietzsche that can fit beside workout advice, startup culture, and inspirational captions. It is also a version that abandons the real problem almost entirely. Take the pain as fuel reading first. It sounds close to Nietzsche because he does care about self-overcoming, transformation, and the possibility that a life can be shaped through what it suffers. But pain as fuel answers a different question from the one we have been following. It says suffering is acceptable because of what it produces later, a stronger self, a more disciplined self, a more impressive self. That is already a bargain. It asks suffering to justify itself by results. If the pain makes you better, then perhaps it was worth it. But Nietzsche's argument has been steadily suspicious of exactly that logic. The moment suffering must earn its place through future payoff, we are still refusing to affirm the life that contains it unless it can be compensated. That is not yet a yes to life. It is a conditional arrangement. The same flattening happens with self-overcoming. In popular language, it means rise above your circumstances and become more powerful. That can sound admirable, but it quickly slips into performance culture. The self becomes a project for extraction. Even suffering becomes a resource to be leveraged. Nietzsche's harder question disappears. Does the need to leverage suffering already reveal that life itself has not been affirmed unless it becomes useful? Will to power suffers a similar fate. It becomes advice about domination, confidence, expansion, or relentless growth. But in the terrain we are tracing here, will to power is not mainly a life hack concept. It belongs to Nietzsche's attempt to think life from within its own dynamics, rather than from moral standards imposed on it from elsewhere. Turning it into a strategy for personal success is not merely simplistic. It reverses the direction of the inquiry. Eternal recurrence gets softened to live so you would want to do it again, make choices you will not regret, seize the day. Those slogans turn a frightening thought into an ethics of urgency. What disappears is the almost unbearable demand of the original test. Could you will the life you already have, including what cannot be improved away, marketed, learned from, or reframed into advantage? Amor Fati may be flattened most of all. It becomes acceptance therapy with a Latin title. Breathe, surrender, release resistance, trust the process. But Nietzsche's phrase is far harsher than therapeutic calm. It does not ask whether you can relax into what happened. It asks whether the will can stop demanding a different past before it will fully claim the life that is here. Why do these flattenings happen so easily? Because instruction feels safer than a verdict. Advice gives the listener something to do. Nietzsche's actual question leaves the listener exposed. It may not yield an actionable technique at all. A person can live well with a slogan. It is much harder to live beside a thinker who asks whether your standard for judging life has already turned against life. There is also a market reason. A quote card Nietzsche sells better than a severe genealogist of consolation. Platforms reward compression, confidence, and utility. The real argument resists all three. It is long, unstable, morally dangerous in places, and not easily made useful without being distorted. So culture trims it until it becomes supportive of goals culture already has. But the cost of that trimming is not only intellectual, it is moral. Once Nietzsche becomes a toughness coach, people start using him to admire endurance in situations where endurance should not be the only question. The wound becomes a badge. The crushed person becomes a failed aspirant to strength. The pressure to make suffering productive returns in philosophical costume. That is almost the opposite of the clarity Nietzsche was trying to force. A good diagnostic test is simple. Take any hard Nietzsche line and imagine converting it into a motivational poster. Ask what disappears first. Usually it is the tension, the danger, the ambiguity, the possibility that Nietzsche's demand is too much, the possibility that affirmation may be impossible in some cases, the possibility that consolation, though suspect, still answers a real human need. Poster Nietzsche loses all of that. What remains after the flattening is a philosophy of optimization. What vanishes is a philosophy of judgment. And our whole episode has been about judgment, about the moment suffering stops being pain and starts speaking as if it had the authority to condemn life. So the internet version of Nietzsche is not just shallower than the real one, it often answers the wrong question entirely. Instead of asking whether suffering counts as an objection to life, it asks how suffering can make you stronger. Instead of interrogating consolation, it supplies a new form of it. Instead of exposing the court, it gives the court new slogans. That is why the final convergence matters. Once the flattenings are cleared away, the real question returns with more weight than before. Nietzsche has not solved suffering. He has not made it beautiful. He has not made it useful. He has changed the status of the verdict suffering seems to pronounce. And that change matters precisely because so many false versions of Nietzsche leave the original wound untouched. They give the listener a role to play. Be stronger, be harder, be grateful for the obstacle. But the person who lies awake asking whether life itself has been exposed as defective is not helped much by that script. They need the question restored at full severity. Only then can Nietzsche say anything different from the motivational culture that borrows his name. That is what the ending has to bring back. There is a quieter flattening too, and it is more tempting because it sounds morally careful. It says Nietzsche is only teaching us to reframe. Do not call pain an objection, call it material. Do not ask why life hurts, ask what the hurt reveals. That sounds deeper than motivational culture, but it can still keep the same bargain alive. Pain is admitted only after it has been made useful to insight. The problem is subtle. Insight can be real. A person can learn from suffering. A life can become more truthful because certain illusions have broken. Nietzsche is not denying that. He is denying that suffering needs to become educational before life is allowed to include it. Once pain must produce wisdom, we have smuggled the old tribunal back in through a more elegant door. This is why the anti-self-help point is not a stylistic preference. It is central to the argument. Self-help turns suffering into a currency. Spend enough pain, receive growth, endure the wound, collect meaning. Nietzsche's question is different because it asks whether life can be affirmed before the accounting works out. That is much harder and much less marketable. You can test this by removing the payoff. Suppose the pain leaves no clear lesson. Suppose it does not make you kinder, braver, deeper, more disciplined, more successful, or more spiritually impressive. Suppose it simply becomes one of the facts that now belongs to the life. Does the life become less affirmable because the suffering failed to become productive? If the answer is yes, then we are still judging life by a redemptive economy. That redemptive economy is everywhere. It is in the sentence that everything happens for a reason, and also in the secular sentence that everything can become growth. The religious and secular versions may disagree about the source of meaning, but they share the refusal to let pain remain without profit. Nietzsche is dangerous because he asks what remains when profit is removed. This also keeps us away from a false conclusion. The point is not that Nietzsche gives us better coping advice than the people who misuse him. The point is that he may not be giving coping advice at all. He is changing the court in which coping, consolation, pessimism, resentment, and affirmation are judged. Go back to the quiet room from the beginning. Something happened, or something failed to happen, or something slowly became undeniable, and beside the event itself, another thought appeared. If life can contain this, what kind of life is it? A little later, the thought hardened. A life that contains this cannot really be called good. At first, that can sound like the pain speaking for itself. It can sound immediate, almost self-evident, as if the hurt had already settled the question of existence. Nietzsche wants to alter only one thing there. He wants to change the status of the verdict. The pain remains real, the loss remains real, the wrong remains wrong where wrong has occurred. But the sentence against life no longer appears as a fact delivered by suffering alone. It begins to look like suffering plus a standard. The event hurts, and then the hurt is measured. The measurement is not identical with the hurt. That standard had to be there already. Life should not expose us like this. A worthy world would not leave bodies this fragile. A good existence would not contain this much humiliation, this much dependency, this much chance, this much grief. We may sympathize with those standards deeply. We may still partly believe them. Nietzsche's point is not that they are silly. His point is that they are standards, not raw facts. So where did they come from? Not from life itself in any straightforward way. History does not show us a life exempt from loss. Biology does not promise us bodies that will not break. Desire does not come with a guarantee of satisfaction. Consciousness has never included immunity from grief, boredom, contingency, or dependence. The standards come from interpretations about what kind of life should count as worthy. Some of those interpretations came from Schopenhauer's diagnosis that willing is itself a source of suffering. Some came from tragic attempts to hold terror without condemnation. Some came from the hunger for meaning. Some came from ascetic moralities that redeem suffering by placing value beyond life. Some came from consolations that teach us, gently or severely, that a truly worthy world would be less exposed than this one. When those interpretations harden, they build a tribunal. Life appears before the court already under terms it did not write. Then suffering arrives as evidence. The verdict follows quickly because the standards were prepared in advance. This is Nietzsche's hardest move, and also his most easily misunderstood one. He does not say suffering is good. He does not say no one may judge life harshly. He does not say every protest is immature or life-denying. He says the court was built, therefore the verdict is not simple nature speaking. It is judgment shaped by inherited valuations that changes the scene without redeeming it. If the court was built, then the sentence against life can be examined. It can be asked what picture of the good it depends on. It can be asked whether that picture ever described life as we have it. It can be asked whether the expectation of a painless, justified, finally consolable existence is a standard life was always bound to fail. Perhaps after all that examination, someone still condemns life. Nietzsche allows for that possibility more than his advertisers do. He does not force a triumphant yes. He asks for cleaner honesty about what the no depends on. Is the no coming from the pain itself, or from a demand that life become something other than finite, embodied, changing and vulnerable before it deserves affirmation? There is a moral seriousness in that cleaner honesty. It prevents two sentimental shortcuts. The first is to comfort ourselves by pretending life would be innocent if only suffering pointed elsewhere. The second is to condemn existence without noticing the interpretive framework already built into the condemnation. Nietzsche distrusts both forms of haste. What opens in their place is not peace. It is a small interval of thought. Pain and verdict are no longer identical. The harshest sentence in the room can be heard as a sentence, not as unmediated revelation. That may sound minor. In some lives it is enormous. It means the reflex against life is not the only language available. The event still wounds. The judgment is no longer invisible. We should also keep the limit in view. Exposing the tribunal does not dissolve suffering. It does not heal trauma. It does not guarantee affirmation. Some wounds remain close to impossible to bring under any meaningful yes. Nietzsche's contribution is not a solution at that level. It is a transformation in how the question of suffering is framed. Instead of asking only whether suffering refutes life, he asks what right our standard has to expect a life without suffering, fragility, transience and loss. That question can sound severe because it turns the critique back on the judge, but it also prevents us from smuggling a purified fantasy of existence into the terms by which actual existence is condemned. There is something almost modest in that final effect. Nietzsche does not leave you with a healed world. He leaves you with a less innocent condemnation and a more difficult possibility of affirmation. The condemnation may still win, the possibility may still feel impossible, but the lines of the problem are clearer. That clarity can matter in very practical ways. It may mean that the next time the mind says life itself has failed, you hear a second layer in the sentence. You hear the older ideal inside it. You hear the demand that life should have offered safety, completion, or final justification before earning your consent. The suffering may still be overwhelming, but the judgment is no longer invisible, and that clarity is enough to carry into the closing. We return to the room, not because the pain has changed, but because the verdict no longer sounds as though it built itself. The tribunal image is useful because it shows how suffering can be both evidence and not the whole case. Evidence does not speak by itself. It is entered into a court, interpreted under rules, weighed against a standard, and then made to support a sentence. A wound can be evidence of vulnerability, cruelty, chance, dependence, or loss. But when it becomes evidence that life as such is guilty, more has happened than pain alone. Nietzsche wants that more to become visible. The hidden standard may be theological, philosophical, therapeutic, romantic, or simply inherited from childhood hopes no one ever examined. A worthy life should be safe. A worthy world should protect innocence. A worthy existence should make suffering proportionate. A worthy self should be able to integrate every wound into meaning. These standards can feel noble. They can also quietly make actual life impossible to affirm. This does not mean we should lower every moral expectation until nothing can be judged. That would be a grotesque misunderstanding. Some things deserve condemnation precisely because life matters. Cruelty, exploitation, betrayal, and neglect should not be protected by a grand affirmation. Nietzsche's point is not to dissolve moral judgment. It is to stop moral judgment from swelling unnoticed into a metaphysical rejection of existence itself. The distinction is delicate, but it is the heart of the problem. To say this should not have happened may be an act of moral clarity. To say a world in which this can happen is therefore unworthy of affirmation is a different act. It may still be emotionally understandable. It may even feel unavoidable, but it depends on a picture of the world that expected less exposure than any living world has ever offered. Once that picture is visible, the listener is not forced into optimism. They are invited into a harder honesty. Perhaps the no remains. Perhaps the wound still speaks with more authority than any philosophical distinction, but at least the no knows more about itself. It can no longer pretend to be only the voice of pain. It also has to admit the ideal it is defending. After all of that, what remains is not a method. Nietzsche does not hand you a reliable way to survive grief, illness, humiliation, loneliness, boredom, or despair. He does not give you a practice that makes pain lighter on command. He does not give you permission to call suffering good. Anyone selling that in his name has changed the subject. What remains is a changed question. Can a finite life be looked at without first being cleared of every charge? Can a world of bodies, chance, desire, attachment, time, and loss be inhabited without first demanding that it resemble something purer? Can suffering be resisted where it is wrong without putting existence itself in the dock every time pain enters the room? Those questions do not soothe, they sharpen. Some people will still answer them with a no. Some wounds may still sound like an objection in the deepest possible sense. Nietzsche does not erase that. What he interrupts is the automatic slide from pain to final verdict. That interruption matters because it blocks two endings that come too easily. One says, life can be saved only by moving value somewhere beyond life. The other says life is guilty because it failed a standard it never promised to meet. Nietzsche distrusts both. He offers nothing fully safe in their place, only something more austere. Look at the standard. Ask who taught it to you. Ask whether life as actually lived was ever going to satisfy it. There is a kind of mercy in that, though not a warm one. It does not promise hidden innocence in things. It does not ask you to turn pain into growth before pain is allowed to remain. It does not require existence to apologize by becoming unlike itself. It leaves the world hard, but a little less enchanted by borrowed judgments that may still feel like too little. Often it will be. Philosophy should know its limit here. Cleaner judgment does not hold someone through the night. It does not feed the lonely, repair the damaged, or stop the harm that still needs resisting. Thought cannot do everything. Still, even a small clarification can change how a person suffers, not by removing the pain, but by stopping one layer of inherited accusation from passing itself off as pure reality. You may still think life has failed you. You may still wake up angry that this is the kind of world you are in. Nietzsche does not confiscate that anger. He only asks you to notice what has joined itself to the pain. A diagnosis lands, and suddenly the whole arrangement of existence feels darker. A job disappears, and the mind rushes toward betrayal on the scale of life itself. A humiliation will not leave, partly because dropping it would feel like admitting the world was allowed to be made this way. In each case, the pain is real first. Then the larger sentence arrives. Once that sentence is visible as a sentence, the inner weather changes a little. Not because the event becomes acceptable, not because the body relaxes, only because the mind is no longer forced to treat its own verdict as the final voice of reality. You do not have to affirm everything. You do not have to say yes to recurrence. You do not have to make peace with Amor Fati by morning. You can simply become less naive about the standards you carry. That kind of noticing is not glamorous, but it is honest. It keeps the old consolations from sneaking back in disguised as pure realism. It keeps new self-help slogans from pretending they have solved a problem they have only rebranded. That refusal is the thin thing left after the verdict, not triumph, not peace, sometimes not even stability, just a small interval in which the judgment against life can be heard as a judgment, not as nature speaking for itself. And that is not nothing. This is why the ending has to resist drama. A dramatic ending would betray the argument. It would turn Nietzsche into a rescuer at the last moment, as if a severe enough thought could do what consolation once promised to do. But that would only repeat the structure we have been questioning. It would make philosophy the new beyond, the new place where pain is finally justified. The more honest ending is smaller. The listener returns to the same life with one extra distinction. Pain is one thing, the verdict carried by pain is another. The distinction may not feel powerful when the suffering is raw. It may feel almost useless. But it prevents one kind of captivity, the captivity of believing that the harshest interpretation in the room must be reality itself. There is a kind of freedom there, but it is not triumphant. It is closer to intellectual room. A little space opens between the wound and the world picture that rushed to explain it. In that space, a person may still grieve, resist, seek justice, ask for help, or say no. Nietzsche does not take those away. He only makes it harder for the no to hide its own conditions. And perhaps that is the only non-cruel gift this argument can offer. Not strength, not meaning, not a command to affirm, a refusal to let suffering be captured either by consolation or by condemnation too quickly. The pain remains allowed to be pain. The life remains allowed to be questioned. The court, however, is no longer invisible. That is why the question leaves us not with a solved problem, but with a different attentiveness. When the mind says life has been found guilty, listen for the older standard inside the sentence. Listen for the demand that life should have been invulnerable, finally explained, proportionate, morally clean, or guaranteed before it deserved consent. Then ask whether that demand is grief speaking, justice speaking, or a borrowed ideal speaking through both. The answer may change from night to night. Nietzsche's value here is not that he makes the answer easy, it is that he makes the question more exact. Go back to the room one last time. Nothing has been solved by argument. When the house goes quiet again, the pain is still the pain. That has to be said plainly, or philosophy starts lying the moment it comes near real hurt. Nietzsche is not giving you a way to feel better. What may be a little less automatic now is the leap from pain to sentence. At the start, suffering seemed to speak for itself. It seemed to say that a life containing this could not really be called good. Nietzsche asks you to look again, not away from the pain, at the verdict wrapped around it. What we followed tonight was the standard already standing behind that verdict, the expectation that life should have been less exposed than this, less fragile, less brutal, more able to justify itself than any actual life ever does. That expectation did not come from pain alone. It came from interpretations, from consolations, from old habits of judging life by a standard life never promised to meet. That is Nietzsche's contribution here, not comfort, not cure, a harder clarity. He does not tell you to stop grieving. He does not tell you to turn the wound into growth. He does not tell you suffering is secretly good. He asks whether the demand for a different kind of life was already in place before the suffering arrived. Maybe that is as far as you want to go with him. Fair enough. Maybe eternal recurrence still sounds unbearable. Maybe Amor Fati still sounds like too much. Maybe all you can do tonight is notice that pain and verdict are not identical, and that the judgment against life did not arrive alone. That is already a shift. Some nights the answer will still be no. The pain will feel too total, or too raw, or too close to let any space open around it. Nietzsche would not turn that into a moral failure, but on other nights, maybe there is a pause, just long enough to hear the older standard inside the verdict, just long enough to stop treating that standard as nature itself. And sometimes that pause is the whole achievement. Not a new creed, not a stronger personality, just a pause before the sentence hardens. For tonight, we leave it here. The room is still quiet. The verdict may still be there. But now you know a little more about who built the court. One final caution belongs here. If this argument has done anything useful, it has not made suffering noble. It has made the movement from suffering to judgment more visible. That is quieter work, but it may be the only work philosophy can honestly do beside pain, without becoming another form of consolation. So if the room is still hard, let it be hard. The question is not whether you have escaped the verdict. The question is whether you can now hear the verdict as something spoken, inherited, shaped, and therefore open to examination. That small change matters because a borrowed verdict can feel like reality itself when no one has named it. Once named, it may still hurt, but it loses a little of its disguise. You can ask where it came from. You can ask what picture of life it protects. You can ask whether care, grief, resistance, and justice require the whole of existence to be condemned with them. Those questions do not close the wound. They keep the wound from being forced into a false philosophy before it has even been held, and maybe that is enough for one night.